probably help them to contribute to the expensive cost of
it was
education.
a partnership, and they the other thing is that there was not one single trajectory for the kids. It wasn't just sending them to the workplace. They were sending a third of them to the Polytechnic Institute. And another third went on to four-year schools, and another third did go to the workplace. And the school by itself had 6 people whose only job it was to arrange internships and employment for the kids. Wow. Often well into their 40s. So as the kids would go out and industry changed, they'd bring them back and retrain them.
Wow.
Yeah, so.
That's a commitment.
Well, they're a society that's very concerned about having a place for everybody. Right. And they really follow through on it.
Well, and as the world work changes, people have to have new skill sets to be successful, and it's huge economic impact.
Yeah, and they don't dumb down the curriculum. It's all of the kids, they try to get all of the kids to pass the primary exams. And then when they go into middle and high school, the mathematics and the science and the literacy stuff is still as rigorous as it is anywhere else.
Good morning, everybody. We have a few people online. We have a few people in person. Thanks for hanging in there while we get ourselves set up on the Zoom. I'd like to introduce Dr. Mark Conley. He's here to give us some thoughts about how to make education systems better, and I'll let you kind of give your background and introduce
who's out there,
what you've been doing. There's all kinds of people. Yeah. Catherine's out there.
Wygent is there.
Yep. Ray.
Christy Gibson.
Excellent.
There.
Okay.
Excellent.
And you said this is DARTEP. Tell me again.
There's DARTEP and our clinical practice stakeholder group, who has been meeting to try to create some clinical practice requirements for the new system that we're putting in place.
So are these university people, school people?
University people, school people, principals.
Okay.
We have district administrators. We have teachers.
Okay.
So it's across the board.
And how much have you talked about the work of NCEE? And
not a whole lot. I mean, we've been bringing in some of the research. A lot of the research that we brought in for our clinical stakeholder was Linda Darling-Hammond's research.
Okay.
So they do have a little bit of the country comparisons and things like that.
All right. So let me first start out by saying that I'm a Michigander, and I proudly worked with the Department of Education, Michigan Department of Education, for 15 years when I was here, mostly in the assessment work with literacy. So I was in the state for a quarter of a century, so I know the state very well. I've been in Tennessee for the last 10 years. We departed when the Michigan recession hit, the national recession hit 2008. My wife's an architect, and we weren't doing many things, and so that's the main reason that we went to Tennessee. I currently work for the University of Memphis, but a good part of my service and research work is with the National Center on Education and the Economy. I started working with them around 2011, at the same time that I was working with the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. In the National Board work, we were revising the English Language Arts Standards. And the one thing I did not know was that the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards and the National Center on Education and the Economy were founded by the same people. And those people are Mark Tucker, who's my immediate boss, Betsy Brown-Rootsey, and David Mendel. And so those are the people that I work with quite a bit these days. I work with a team of people within NCEE called the Center for International Education Benchmarking. And our job is to take a look at primarily the PISA data, the International Assessments of Literacy in Mathematics and Science. And from that, glean lessons for the US system. And so an example of that, I'll talk about this a little bit more, is going to places like Singapore, the top performers on PISA. I was there 3 weeks ago, spent a week touring the schools and talking to all the education officials and teachers and students. And the idea is that we're not trying to import what they do, but we're trying to learn from what they do to be able to adapt some lessons to our system. My particular focus over the last 2 years has been on trying to develop educator career ladders at the national level. And I'll talk about that a little bit from the standpoint of I have spent 35 years working with beginning teachers, mostly at Michigan State. And one of the conversations I have with them is why get into the profession and what's in it for you? The U.S. right now doesn't have very many good answers to that question. And this is a saying that Mark Tucker has quite frequently, that the job you get as a teacher in the United States is the job you leave when you retire. There's no change. And so the best comparison I could make is between being a teacher and maybe working at Google. 22-year-old starting out, they don't have any opportunities in teaching to be able to advance into more responsible roles and gain greater compensation and responsibility for greater roles. In comparison, when we were in Singapore, they have 3 different career tracks, one for teachers, one for leadership, and one for what they call specialists. And a brand new teacher starting out can start out to become a highly accomplished teacher, move on to become a senior teacher, and then a master teacher and a principal master teacher. But it doesn't end there. At the end of the 3rd level, as a beginning teacher, principals sit you down and say, show the entire career pathways in their system and say, what would you like to be? And then they'll work toward becoming whatever that role is that the individual talks about. So I could, for example, be a teacher in my school, working for headquarters. I could dream of being a Gina Garner. And so what they could do is they could say, I'd like to try that role out. And the system is flexible enough where they could go and do that for a year, and they would get a tremendous amount of support so that they could do that successfully. And at the end of that period of time, they'd say, well, do you want to keep doing that, or would you like to do something else? And the individuals then given support to return to the classroom or continue in that role or move into another role. One thing that you see in the Singapore system that you don't see as often here is that people don't live and die in the same job. In fact, most of the Singapore educators will move about every 6 to 8 years into a different role, and they get support through the system for being in that role. And so you end up with this kind of exciting possibility that not only could you choose to be in a different role with greater responsibility, but the system will help teach you how to do that role successfully. A key part of that at the same time is a system of mentorship, where you don't move into another role unless you have somebody working with you who's highly accomplished in that role. And so they have a system of mentorship. And I can give an example. I met one young teacher at Thammasat High School in Singapore. Her name was Andrea. She's an English language arts teacher, and she had 3 mentors. She had one mentor in English language arts who was recognized as really good at that. And so she could go to that person to figure out any problems or learn any new things with regard to language arts. She had a second mentor who was really good in what they call character education. It's kind of similar to what we would think about in terms of classroom management, although they tend to have more of a proactive building kind of sense of classroom management rather than trying to punish somebody. But this mentor that she had was really good at classroom management or character development. And so Andrea could go to her and talk to her about any issues or things that she wanted to learn. The third thing, and this was kind of fun, and it's fun to talk to Michigan educators in this light. Everybody in the system is assigned an extracurricular activity, or what they call a co-curricular. And so in Andrea's case, she was assigned an extracurricular activity called marching. And if you can imagine, Singapore is a former British colony. And so the co-curricular activity was the kids would get into uniforms and they would march. Not with guns or anything, but they would march. And Andrea had never done anything like that before. And so her third mentor was a teacher who knew how to do marching. And so she got help along the way. Now, the key part, this is the thing that really captivated me about looking at these systems, was what makes it work is the classroom is organized quite a bit differently than what we have over here, without as much rigidity. And where I first got a sense of it was that if someone in a building is highly expert at something, what would happen is that somebody across the building might want to know what they know. And at the building level, they would literally move mountains to make that possible, so those people could get together and they could learn from one another. Take that and take a 1,000-person elementary school and think about how many different ways that could happen. And that's what's embedded in the Singapore system. And so they have the systems of mentorship throughout the building. They have the different kind of career tracks. But at the same time, they reorganize the classroom school or the school day so to make it possible for people to see each other, to talk around classroom instruction, to do lesson study, to do action research. Basically, the whole impetus is to make everybody as expert as they can be. And then the other really key part is to leverage that expertise to improve the whole system. Now, that last piece is something that we are very bad at in the U.S. system. I have, through 35 years, and it started here in Michigan, been able to go out to any school. And it doesn't take very long to figure out who's really good at something. But the interesting thing is our system is, for the most part, pretty blind about who they are. And so my story in Memphis is there were two teachers that I worked with for quite a bit of time. Each had 25 and 30 years of experience in working with literacy with young children. They had an incredible record of being able to help kids learn how to read by grade 3. I know that's a big issue in conversation in this state right now. And they were doing it. I mean, forgive the term, they were kicking ass in terms of teaching the kids to read by grade 3. And this is in an urban school, high poverty community. Interestingly, throughout the city of Memphis, which is a system of 96 elementary schools, people were wringing their hands about how many of the kids couldn't read by grade 3, and it's a significant problem. Corresponds with the high poverty in the city. The local funders were pouring millions of dollars into trying to find the next magic bullet. And ironically, nobody was asking these teachers what they were doing. And so the opportunity to learn from them was enormous. And until last year, when both of them quit, they retired. And they took all that knowledge with them. They never had a student teacher. They never had anybody that learned from them. And the system lost an opportunity to take advantage of probably the greatest resource they have. So I know I could leave this building right now. I could go into any building throughout the state, and there are absolute gems of teachers that know a lot of what they're doing. And the interesting part is, a lot of them will say they didn't get that way necessarily through the system as it exists right now. A lot of them will say that they got the way they are because they found mentors by themselves once they get out of school. And the real tragedy is, I know the Michigan system has literally thousands of these teachers out there and nobody pays attention to them. And the really important part of this work, I think, is to identify those people and build a system around them. It starts with teacher education. I have often wondered why we don't take that kind of an approach in terms of developing good teacher education programs around teachers that have become very, very accomplished themselves. But it also extends into thinking about things like professional learning. When I was in Singapore, we visited the Academy of Singapore Teachers. It's the primary professional learning arm of the Singapore system. It's entirely run by teachers. When I was there, there was a group of math educators who had left their classrooms for 6 weeks to solve a problem that was impacting the entire system. They were given rooms to work in, any resources that they needed. Back at their schools, their classrooms were covered, not by substitute teachers, but by other teachers who were really good at what they did. And when the teachers had finished their time at the Singapore Academy of Teachers, they went back to their classrooms and took the knowledge with them, tried out the ideas that they had developed, and shared it with the rest of the system to solve the problem system-wide. We've talked, since I've returned, about creating something like the Academy of Memphis Teachers. Again, basing it in teacher expertise, starting with the idea of talking to the teachers about what do you know and what do you need, and then developing an academy essentially around issues that are really concerning to teachers, again, to basically to leverage the expertise that they have to help the whole system get better. Those are some of the really important things that I think about right now as coming back from Singapore, but actually over the last several years of doing the work that we've been doing at NCEE. So That'll get us started, I suppose.
A starter.
Yeah.
Is and especially since a good part of this group is also this clinical experience
Right.
group. What does Singapore do about student teachers, and how does that experience happen for teachers who are learning?
I'm about to answer that with some very controversial comments, so I'll warn you ahead of time. But keep in mind, I've been doing this a long time. Singapore has one teacher education institution, the National Institute of Education. And it's different from country to country, but one of the things you see in the top performing countries is they limit the number of teacher education institutions. And the reason is quality control. One of the astonishing things we found out about Singapore is the National Institute of Education is their sole teacher preparation agency, but they are also their own accreditation agency, which seems like an enormous conflict of interest. But their whole issue is that they want to make sure that they maintain the high levels of quality that they have in their system. Since there's a large clinical group out there, let me tell you about the Singapore admissions process. And again, it's similar in some of the other countries, and I can list some of the countries for you to take a look at. But they have a really rigorous admissions system that starts with, they set up a system to attract the best and the brightest. And it starts with, now imagine if you did this in Michigan, a deep analysis of all of the other professions that the college kids could choose from. So they look at the starting salaries of engineering, of architecture, of lawyers, of doctors, and the whole spectrum of choices that people graduating from college might have. Then they look at the salaries of incoming teachers, and they put them on par. So you have to consider, and this is what I keep coming back to, 21-year-old beginning teachers have a lot of choices. And if they read the media and they see that the working conditions out in schools are crap and the starting salaries are crap and you don't get much better across your career, what would you do? And so what the top performing countries have done, and there are different versions of this in Finland, in Estonia, former Soviet Republic, which is one of the top performers, in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, in Ontario, in British Columbia, and so many other places, where they've basically taken this approach where they say we have to build up the profession and we have to get the best people in it. My message to Michigan legislators would be this: you've done a really good job breaking the backs of the unions, but what have you done to build up the profession? And that's basically the issue that I'm talking about here. You've got to get good people to choose. So 20 years ago, Singapore and Finland started out with the idea that they have to make the profession attractive. And they have to get the best people. And it took them 20 years to put a lot of these kind of changes in place. Both countries will attract the top 30% from the top 30% of their college graduates into the teaching profession. And a whole lot of students apply, and they only accept somewhere between 8 and 10%. That's the reverse picture that we have here, where we're basically getting warm bodies in the chairs. And so you have to take a really deliberate policy-focused approach on this to get the best and the brightest. And we can have a lot of debates about sometimes the not-so-smart kid is going to make a great teacher. But I don't want that teacher in math classrooms, for example, or if they don't have the subject matter knowledge they need. I want to make sure they got the subject matter knowledge they need. And it's rare that we take the next step, which is to make sure they're well prepared. So in these admissions processes that you see in some of these other countries, they don't focus exclusively on GPA. What they'll do is they'll look at somebody's qualifications and they'll have an interview panel. And the interview panel will have the person come in and they'll ask them some questions. And what they're looking for are dispositions toward being a good teacher. They figure they can teach them a lot of things, but if they don't interact well with kids and they don't work well in the school, it's not really worth a whole lot of time trying to develop them as a teacher. So they'll have an interview, they'll ask them to teach a lesson, and if they pass the first round of admissions procedures, they'll have them go to a school for 3 months. And while they're in the school for 3 months, they'll watch them. And they watch for, again, their ability to work with adults, their ability to work with kids. And at the end of 3 months, if they have passed muster after having everybody observe them, then at that point is when they'll say, okay, we'll admit you to the teacher education program. Now notice it's a whole lot of stuff that's happened in the field before they even get in. In Singapore, and it's different in different countries, once you pass that threshold, you become a government employee. And what that means is you take your classes, you do your teacher education, it's all paid for by the government, and you get a stipend. The return that you have to give is that once you get through and you become a teacher, you have to agree to teach in the Singapore system for 3 years. Now, the other statistic that's kind of eye-opening is those people that make it past the 3 years stay in the system 90% of the time. So the people that go through this kind of a system, they only lose 10% of them between the time they start and the time they end. 10% of the people that for some reason it doesn't work out or they choose other careers. That's very different from the data that you'd see in the United States right now. So we have an 8% teacher attrition rate right now nationally. It's much higher in other parts of the country. Singapore has an attrition rate of 4% a year. So the United States attrition rate is double what it is in a lot of other countries. And at the same time, our enrollment in teacher education colleges, we've probably had some discussion about this, is on average 35%. At the University of Memphis, where I am, the enrollment drop since 2009 is 75%. We are not getting people to choose to be teachers. And it's quite logical when you think about it in terms of other professions, why this is happening. And at the same time, and I'm sure a lot of you know, experienced teachers like the ones that I mentioned, were teaching kids how to read by grade 3, are fleeing the profession in droves. And if you look at Linda Darling-Hammond's research on the Learning Policy Institute website, it's because of poor working conditions and lack of administrative support. Those are things that are really confronting us right now. I worry for university-based programs because I don't see them changing much. In fact, the institution I'm at right now is trying to get as good as Eastern Michigan University was. We have to be much more forward-thinking given the circumstances that we're in. And I'll throw another little gem out there. We are focusing a lot on developing residency programs. Everybody's crazy over residency programs, but we have to remember that the schools that we're working in right now were created in the 1950s. And so if we just immerse our students into schools that were created for the 1950s, we're not necessarily planning well for the future. And so one of our biggest challenges is to try to figure out how to help our teacher education students learn to be adaptable and future-proof. And if all we do is we just put the students out there and expect them to become teachers through osmosis, we're not going to be doing the job, and we're not going to be around. So that's some of the concerns that I have right now. And these opinions have nothing to do with Michigan Department of Education. They're solely Mark Conley's opinions. Right. So.
Do we have any right now?
No, none have popped up online.
What do you mean by future proof?
Well, we know, you know, that schools are going to have to change. I gave the example before, but it was online about in Singapore, they take very deliberately the notion of future proofing, and they have one school where there are 6 people that keep constant communication with business and industry in terms of their needs. They focus on future-proofing their students, and the way that they do it is they invite business and industry into the school to help structure their programs. But the 6 people that are working in central office on the internships, their focus is on keeping track of the kids to make sure the kids' skills are currently up to date, but also they're always looking ahead in terms of thinking about what's going to be required in the future. Let me give you a little example. Memphis is a warehouse city. We have International Paper, we have Federal Express, UPS, big organizations like that. They have massive warehouses to move their goods. Just last week, Federal Express announced that they were going to dramatically reshape their warehouse operations, making them much more robotic. They said, yeah, we're going to have some more jobs, but they're going to be high-tech jobs where you have to know how to do stuff to maintain the robotics line. I can tell you right now, that's also going to mean literally thousands of people are about to lose their jobs because they're not going to be able to make that shift. And so we're going to have to create schools that help our kids make those sorts of shifts throughout their lifetime. But more importantly, I think, is we're going to have to help teachers who are able to make those shifts in their lifetime. You know, we've got things like you've got the Michigan Virtual School Network and all that sort of thing that have made significant kind of shifts. But we've got to keep thinking about schools are going to keep moving the ball. They're going to have to keep moving the ball if they're going to become relevant, unless we expect the businesses and industries to take over education entirely. We're going to need to form some partnerships at the school level, but we can't leave teacher education out. And what I see right now is that people are romanticizing the immersion into school environments, but they're not thinking about the school environments themselves. And I think that's a really big issue confronting us. So I can walk over to old Patton Gill School here, and it's a building that hasn't been touched since the 1920s. And I can find, and this is the other part of our dilemma as a society in the US, I can also walk to the new Patton Gill Middle School and see a pretty spiffy new building. We've got these disparities in our system at the same time, and that's also part of the challenge. So my wife is an architect, former math educator, and she's working on a $100 million, 3,000 student high school out in the suburbs of Memphis. But I can drive across town, very short drive. It's just like here with Detroit. And I can walk into a building that hasn't been touched since the 1920s. And yet these are all the same American kids that are being served somehow by our systems. We're sending our teacher education students into that disparity at the same time. And it's not enough to me to just push social justice as a theory, because when we take a look at our society, that theory or whatever theories are out there are in action. And we clearly have some kids that are served well and other kids that are not served at all. It's embedded in our system, and that's a big challenge for a lot of the work we're doing.
You can see a lot of the challenges that we're having with that.
Yeah.
A couple of questions.
Yeah.
First, how do some of the top performing countries go about identifying the teachers, the superstar teachers, to capitalize on the teacher expertise?
That's one of the things that we were over there trying to look more closely at, because it's something we've kind of struggled to get more detail about. But in Singapore, it starts with the national goals, which are on their webpage. If you go to the Singapore Ministry of Education, they've recently revamped their goals for their educational system. And so their admissions policies and their evaluation policies for teachers are all focused on those particular goals. And so we saw a number of different kind of rubrics that were basically more of an elaboration of each of those kind of goals. And so in the case of Singapore, the thing that was kind of really amazing, we focused a lot on subject matter here. Of course, a lot of the Asian countries have focused on subject matter expertise. And the Singapore educators got to a point where they said, we're doing that too much. We're stressing out the kids and we're not paying attention to the whole child or development of kids for the future. And so they changed their goals to focus more on well-being, on citizenship, nurturing and care. And so when they take a look at somebody coming into teacher education, they want somebody who's really high on those scales. So this is very unusual for me, but as I was going out to the schools, I heard words like love, nurturing, pastoral care as being really important priorities. And the thing that was quite striking is that you could see it in the things that were up in the hallways, and you could walk into the classrooms and see actual kinds of examples. And the mentorship, the mentors were focused on those sorts of things. So these are funny American teacher education stories, not so funny, but I've had students that have come in to teaching and they want to have summers off. They want to be able to exercise power trips over students. They don't want to work particularly hard. Those students would be flagged and they wouldn't get into the teacher ed program. So it's a much more kind of whole person kind of perspective that they apply to that. What frustrates me here is that, and this is where not only my experience as a teacher educator, but also taking a look at some of these other countries, is I look at the CAPE standards right now, which are much broader than they have been in the past in terms of accreditation. And we put together these lofty standards, and as a culture, we have this enormous capacity to say, well, it's just GPA. And so there's a problem there, I think. We know, we can think of all sorts of different examples where GPA was okay. I've had a number of very bright kids who had high GPAs that I wouldn't want them near kids. It's being able to discriminate on a number of different kind of levels about what we know, or what we can learn to know about what's good teaching. So when we reduce it just to one thing, I think we're really doing a disservice to our profession. And that's what a lot of these countries have realized, is they really want, and it's interesting because it's a focus on the whole child, but it's also a focus on the whole teacher, and thinking about what a real career in this profession might be, and who's ready for that sort of thing. So
I have a question for you.
yeah.
I'm curious as to how you would describe the children in Singapore, their family life. You know, I think of Asian culture as a very strong family, intergenerational family situation. Do you see big differences from your observations there to an American family where children are being raised?
Let me preface that by saying, and Gina and Sean know this, I've spent most of my 35 years teaching in urban schools. And a good part of my career here was spent in Flint and Lansing and parts of Detroit. And so that I resonate with kids who have backgrounds of that sort. In Singapore, and I'll go back to Sean's question too about information within the system. They know that they have families that are dysfunctional. They know that they have families that are falling apart. They know that they have poverty. Overall, it's a more affluent society, a more cohesive society in some ways than ours. A misconception about a lot of the Asian countries is that they're all monolithic in terms of ethnicity. Singapore has 3 different major ethnic groups: Chinese, Malaysian, and people from India. They consider their mother tongue to be English. So what was interesting is listening to the Singapore educators talk about their ability to find out what was going on in the home. They work very closely with the Ministry of, in our case, it would be social services, and talked about kids coming to school just boiling with anger because they were coming out of home situations where they were being abused, or the family had broken up, or there were poverty kind of situations happening. Even though the society strives for a place for everyone in the society, it doesn't mean that people don't drop out, and that happens. So what I saw was, given the conditions that they had, a remarkable ability to say, every kid who sits in front of me is a kid that's a unique individual that I need to pay attention to. And that's ingrained in the teachers, it's ingrained in the system. And the system has developed a remarkable responsiveness to those sorts of things. So in primary school, they know that from over time, that they have different sorts of circumstances that they're going to need to deal with. And so they go through and they screen for things like dysfunction in families, angry kids, low levels of literacy, dyslexia, difficulty with mathematics. And then they have an enormous database where they keep track of the kids. And their philosophy, quite interesting. They don't develop an army of special education people when they figure out they've got dyslexic kids. They figure they're going to get well-prepared teachers in front of every kid, and some kids are going to need more than one teacher. And so what they'll do is they'll say, okay, I've got this many kids that are dealing with anger issues at home. We've got teachers that are well-trained in dealing with that. Or if they don't have the training, we'll make sure they get it. But the philosophy is that keep everybody included in a class. And for the kids that need extra help, there'll be another teacher. And that other teacher can work with them in a variety of ways. It could be right in the class. It could be outside the class. It could be in any number of ways that the building organizes. What we found was a remarkable porousness of the system to be able to and be able to adapt and be adept at figuring out how to deal with an individual kid. It was funny, at one point, we were in front of a group of high school students who had been through the whole system. And we were allowed to ask them a bunch of questions about, how they felt about their teachers and the system. And they kind of made a joke out of the uniqueness factor of each kid. So one of our group asked the kids if they felt unique in any way, and one kid looked at us and said, "Well, I'm not unique, but I'm a limited edition." So there is this sense of the importance of children that you have a sense of in Asia, but in Singapore, it's become kind of a thing of our people are our greatest resource. And if we're going to become a great country, then we have to invest in our people. And you saw that spoken about and acted out many, many times. And of course, everybody in our group is looking back at the US, thinking about things like the school to prison pipeline, being in large urban schools and looking at invisible kids and kids who are lost. And part of the charge for us at NCEE, we don't look at the international stuff just for the sake of looking at the international stuff. We want to make our system better. And so one of the things that we're really have been struggling with for many years, is how do we take the vision of what we're seeing there and kind of bring it back here. The scary part of it is I went over there, my assignment was to take a look at the teacher career ladders and really learn as much as I could about it. We all talked about what we saw and realized that it's not just structures, it's fundamental commitments and beliefs that the system has. And then the question becomes, well, you could put a career ladder system here in Michigan, but you've got to have people that have the basic beliefs about children, about their careers and their profession, to be able to drive the whole system in the directions that you want to. That's the big challenge. So.
I do. I know that NCEE has written about the career and technical education programs in top performing countries. Can you comment a little on that?
I'll talk to a couple parts of that I think are significant. Is I haven't spent as much time with that in the work that I've been doing with them, but the biggest thing is talking about the fact that the older vocational education programs are just teaching kids how to turn a screw, and that's not enough for the modern economy. And so I visited Northlight School in Singapore, and you can look at these places online. They have really nice websites. There's the principal there, his name is Martin. And what they do in the primary school is they commit to having every kid be able to pass the primary exams. They don't pull anybody out of that unless there's severe mental impairments, sorts of things. And those kids will get a career training as you would find here in some of the best places. So in the Northlight School, this is a school for kids who didn't pass the primary exams. So what happens is that when the kids come in very young, they do a lot of screening work to figure out who might have trouble. They work like hell to make sure the kids who might have trouble get all the help that they can give them, and they keep track of them throughout the whole thing. They know that even though they resource it to that level, that they're still going to have kids that don't make it. And the reasons could be that it takes them longer. It could be that they need to have some other thing on their plate that might be a choice for what they do with their lives. And that's where Northlight School comes in. There are 4 schools like Northlight School. They work really closely with the parents. And I was just sitting there thinking about how this would play out in the US, and thinking that one of the perceptions that parents might have is that this is a dumbed down school and it's a tracking sort of thing. What we heard from Singapore is that they work very closely with the parents who are already knowledgeable that their kids are having a rough time. And they say, well, our commitment is to make sure your child has a pathway. This is not like what you hear about in horror stories about Germany and tracking. It's more about there's a menu of choices here, and we want to make sure that your child has the ability to pursue this menu and find a spot for themselves. So at Northlight, what you'd see when you walk in was a massive center area where administrative staff work. And in that area, there are 6 people whose full-time job is to interact with local businesses, bring them into the school, and arrange internships for the students, and in fact, arrange employment for the students. And one of the things they talked to us about was that when they do that, they always have to go out to the business and talk to the adults to make sure that they're going to be nice to the kids. Because they actually have the kids doing adult-like roles, but they have to remind the adults sometimes, well, they are just kids. So going further into the school, and Martin described the program, they've turned over entire classrooms and entire wings of the building to local businesses. So in my case, I thought about this in terms of Memphis. This would be like going over to Federal Express and saying, you need well-educated workers, come on over here and we'll give you a playground so that you can prepare some students. Give you a non-example, I'm good friends with the guy that is the maintenance supervisor for all of the FedEx planes all over the world. And he and I have had conversations about, has anybody from the education system ever come to talk to you? And his answer is no. And he is constantly frustrated because he says the universities, the local schools, they all send me people. They try to prepare them as CEOs of large companies. I need people that can crunch numbers. I need people that can analyze data. And the universities are not doing that. So in this case, in Northlake, they've done a really, really good job of bringing the companies in. And as we talked about before, yeah, the companies are investing as partners. This is part of this. It's all part of the national commitment in Singapore to making sure that the education system is the best it can be. And so I walked into one of the classrooms and it was set up like a grocery store. Kids were learning how to work in a grocery store in terms of doing inventory. One kid was learning how to run a hand truck that could lift massive amounts of weight. The other kids were cheering him on. The interesting thing is when you take a look at the curriculum, it's not dumbed down. It's the same level of mathematics and science and literacy that you would see across the system. So it's not a lesser curriculum. And where you can really tell that that's being played out is there are 3 different places that the kids go once they graduate from Northlake. They either go into the Singapore Polytechnic Institute, where they're doing a lot of high-tech artificial intelligence, manufacturing kind of work. So they're prepped for doing that sort of thing. About a third of the kids go there. A third of the kids go on to 2- and 4-year colleges, and a third of the kids go into the workplace. And the thing that was really impressive is they talked about future-proofing the kids from the standpoint they get a lot of information about how the industries are changing just from ongoing collaboration with the industries. But at the same time, they keep track of the kids closely as they move into their careers. And if the kid loses their job because technology came in, they'll bring the kid back for retraining. And this can happen well into their adult life. They keep track of all of the kids. This is the place where they go back. It's kind of the mothership. And so they'll retrain the kids and they'll get them hooked up with another industry. And so, yeah, it's a big commitment, but they view every kid as a potential resource in building the economy and building country.
So I like this idea of future-proofing in education.
Yeah.
So who pays for that?
That's the interesting thing. Where are the legislators?
They're actually meeting right now.
Right.
How's education reform?
Good. Okay. Well, this is my message. Well, let me tell you this, and let's see. Step up to the plate. The Singapore system is well resourced. They say that we need to invest in our people. We need to invest in our education system. And so I had dinner with a high school principal, and I talked to him about the idea of staffing. And I said, okay, so I know you've got this enormous database of information on the kids before they enter your school. I said, how do you figure out staffing relative to the needs that you can see? And he said, I go into it knowing that I have additional funds in case I don't count right. That's what he said it. But he said, I have a basic budget, and then I know that if I need additional stuff, I got another 100,000, 200,000 that I can work with. And I said, well, things being as they are, sometimes you can still not count right. What happens if you use that money up? And he said, I call the cluster superintendent, which is a district superintendent in our language. And that afternoon I had what I need. And so there's this sense of, I know how it plays out here, all those damn union people that just want more and more. In that case, there's a sense of trusting their people to make good decisions on behalf of their children. And they don't want anybody to go without what they might need. Okay. And so that's the philosophy. So my message to the legislators is, okay, you broke the backs of the unions. I said this earlier. It's time to now start talking about what do we do to build our system up? What do we do to create a system that we can be proud of? take all that other crap away, but just think about what are we doing for our kids? What are we doing for the future of our country?
I'm interested in knowing how they work with young people to help them identify their future career and education interests.
We saw a bit of that in terms of the the Northlight School kind of philosophy. You'll also see that in sorts of things in the elementary schools and in the secondary schools. We saw, for example, in the science curriculum, a hydroponics project where the kids were raising vegetables that they would sell to the teachers at exorbitant prices. Learning economics too. But there is not this philosophy. I didn't detect this philosophy of go to college, go to college, go to college as the higher goal. It was, no, your job is to make the most of yourself. And the job is to try to help you make decisions about the different sorts of pathways that are out there. You see it in the teacher career track. At the third level, a principal will sit a teacher down and say, now's the time to kind of decide what your future is going to be. We do the same sorts of things with the kids. And it's so embedded in the system. We heard reports that if a principal for some reason forgets to say that to a teacher at the third level, they get mad. Because the expectation throughout the system is human development is normal and natural and desirable. And so you have to put as many different kinds of options on the plate as you can. And then the other piece, and this is important for our kids, there's a lot of research about our kids having unreasonable expectations for careers and no clue about how to get there. You have to be able to help guide them in some very tangible ways, even trying things out and seeing if you like it, and if you don't like it, it's okay. There are other sorts of things that you can do.
So that's done more through the teaching and a separate guidance focused program.
It's a remarkable thing. I didn't see armies of special education certified teachers. I did not see armies of counselors. I didn't, what I saw was in the system continual kinds of messages and capacity building that was really kind of built into the system. If there are people that are certified in those areas, they tend to work in headquarters. But they're really trying to build the capacity of the people that are in the trenches. And part of that capacity building is the people in the trenches get to do a lot of other things besides their existing role. A couple examples for the teachers that were kind of eye-opening to me is teachers, depending on their specialty area, would be provided staff development opportunities that would be unheard of here. The vice principal at Tamasek High School did his master's in mathematics education at the University of Michigan. I encountered one person who did her counseling degree at Stanford. One foreign language teacher was really interested in Russian dialects because she teaches Russian. They sent her to Russia for a year. There's a real international, global kind of focus that you see throughout the educational system. The teacher preparation students will spend at least a semester in another country, and typically a less structured system than Singapore's, so that they understand how to operate in different sorts of systems and then come back to Singapore with that understanding and be able to be creative in their work. There's an expectation throughout the system that as you gain expertise, you need to share it. And so there's this sense of no single person has the answer, but together through collaborative kind of work, they do. For you professors out there, that means our work changes too. There aren't any professors teaching methods classes there. Instead, professors do a lot of what I've done most of my career, which is you provide support for helping people learn how to be mentors, helping people learn how to do action research in their work, playing primarily supportive roles in terms of teaching the curriculum standards, or the teaching the curriculum as it's taught and learned in the schools. Professors, by and large, don't get into what's called craft knowledge, the how-tos. That's left up to accomplished teachers. And so it's interesting kind of synergy between professors and teachers in that sense, because my role is more, I got to make darn sure that the students understand the literacy standards and the assessments and so forth. But I'm not going to cross the line and say, this is how you do it, because I have a conversation with a person out here who's doing it every day, and they have strengths in terms of the how-tos, and they're continually learning how to do it better. And that's a better place for the students to learn it. So I think in our country, people are really scared about that sort of change because I think they feel it tends to undermine their existing roles. But if you can step back and you kind of think of it kind of from a logical standpoint, it makes a lot of sense to be able to play it that way. So.
Just a quick mention for those online, there is a chat function. If you wanted to ask a question, we're monitoring the chat. Please feel free to throw in a question. I have one that's gonna kind of take a different direction.
Sure.
You talked about the residencies.
Yeah.
And you know, we've been talking a lot about
Right.
residencies.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing how our system is right now,
Right.
what recommendations would you have in terms of thinking about residencies and pursuing them?
The best residencies across my entire career, and I'm proud to say we did this at Michigan State for a long time, are benchmarked and they're developmental. And so it's not throwing the students out there and saying, okay, soak everything in. I've got a group of students right now that I'm teaching that have literally been thrown out of the schools. They're sitting there reading paragraphs and having the kids answer questions in a special education classroom week after week after week. Nobody's talking to them about what they're experiencing. Nobody has developed any sort of a plan for how they're going to get better. The Michigan State model that we had is a really good one from the standpoint of starting very simply, maybe one-on-one instruction, and then basically doubling the role, increasing the sophistication of the role, and doubling the responsibility every semester. Now, we were doing that at Michigan State across 4 years. I've seen, step into another controversy, I've seen some residency programs, a Boston teacher residency, that are able to accomplish what we did in a single year. But the key issue is that they're focusing on the starting point for the incoming students. And then they're focusing on what's the next step, what's the next step, what's the next step, and let's make sure they're ready for the next step. So you need a benchmarked and a developmental curriculum that's a field-based curriculum. It's not the same as setting up a series of courses. It's a thing of you're working with human beings and you're trying to develop skill here. Let me bring it back to a personal kind of experience that I had. I was a flight instructor at Lansing Community College. I got to be a flight instructor because I was a good pilot, okay? Driving back to Michigan State one morning, I thought to myself, geez, I get to do that because I'm a good pilot. How come I get to be a teacher educator? Get to be a good teacher educator, or get to be a teacher educator because I can write about it.
Yeah,
There's a
right.
problem there. And so the issue is, what we're trying to develop here is knowledge and expertise and skill. And you don't get that just from an inoculation from a course. It can lay the groundwork, but we have to think deliberately about what that residency is going to look like. I would love it if people went out and talked to practicing teachers about what they think. Interestingly, they've been practicing for so long, they may have forgotten about how they got good. But it would be interesting to ask them a question about how did you get really good at what you do? And then think about crafting a residency according to what they say. And also think very seriously about something we rarely do well in this country, and that's developing a mentoring system. We've done it piecemeal, and I can say that from Michigan because my wife was an 8th grade math teacher at Holt Junior High. We just say, here, you're a mentor, and throw them $100 maybe. And then everybody walks away and nobody does anything. And so then we're kind of surprised that, well, maybe we don't want to do mentoring anymore. Mentoring is a serious issue, and it starts with figuring out who's really, really good at what they do as a teacher. But then understanding that mentoring is about interacting with adults too, and that you have to have somebody that's really good at that. And quite often, if you engage teachers in conversation about how they got really good at what they do, they will have insights about how to help somebody. And that's where I think you can really develop some good mentoring programs.
Is there, in the mentoring that happens over in countries you've studied, is there deliberate work on how to give constructive feedback and how to develop another person?
I met a guy named David at the National Institute of Education, and his sole job as a professor is to do that sort of thing. his whole responsibility was mentoring programs and mentoring issues and helping people learn how to do that better. And a lot of the work was connected to the Singapore Academy of Teachers. So there was a constant kind of feedback and iterative loop between the teachers and what was happening at the university to make the mentoring programs better.
So it doesn't end.
It doesn't end.
They continue to get professional development as mentors.
That's right.
So they
Yeah, and a lot of the stuff, it's about continuous improvement. In the educator career ladder stuff that we've done in this country, they were piecemeal and they were short term. I've talked to people in Tennessee where we had a lot of career ladder stuff going in the late 80s and early 90s. They would get 3 positive interviews or 3 positive observations from a principal, and somebody hand them a check for $500. So the teachers were left there going, "Oh, I'm good. Do I have to stay good? Do I have to do something else? Am I going to get more money?" And so, of course, the legislators, yeah, I'm with you on this one. After a couple of years of spending all this money in such a superficial program, the legislators were saying, well, the test scores aren't getting any better. And so they killed the programs. Well, it's logical why that happened. It wasn't ingrained in the system, and it wasn't set up in a very rich way that was continuously getting better, getting the teachers better, but also getting the kids better. And that's a big part of the challenge, is to go systemic instead of superficial. That's really the issue here.
Do we have any questions online?
No, none have been posted.
I made them all mad.
Your controversial statements.
Hey, I'm heading to my mid-60s. I say what's on my mind. So
You're retiring at the end of this semester.
I'm retiring at the end of the semester.
Has it been formally announced?
Or was it just formally announced?
Secret.
No, my plans are to finish my university career on May 1st, and I'll continue with this work with NCEE. Especially coming back from Singapore, it made it, the kind of work that's important to me is to try to get this work more systemic. And I can go back and try to help a university program get better, but what I'm talking about here has a lot to do with our entire system, and that's really where I want to spend my time.
Christy Gibson says, "Thank you for your time today. We learned a lot." So she's East Point Schools, which is we're in Macomb County.
Oh yeah, I remember East Point.
Excellent.
Thank you.
So, any closing thoughts? I mean, what we understand, it's the system. We understand that we do have to address the legislature with this too. But what are your thoughts on starting points on how to start working on the system? It seems like an overwhelming task.
It is if you try to take a look at entire states. One of the conversations we have inside NCEE is about where would you start, and we have a couple of different responses to that. One is at the district level, because superintendents have a lot more power sometimes than they realize. And what we really need to get this going is examples. and if we can get some district examples, that would be great. 2 weeks ago, the state of Maryland passed a proposal where they have adopted the 9 blocks of reform. That is basically an NCEE document. And they are about to embark on dramatically changing their system along those 9 different variables that are behind the success of the top performing countries. Those include things like making sure you have a sustained, focused funding base. Things can't disappear on you. But also commitments to early childhood education, having an abundant supply of well-prepared teachers. Really a lot of things in our system that are all interrelated, and that's the difficult part of this. But Maryland's the first state in the union that has said we want to rise to the level of world-class standards, and we're willing to take it on knowing the complexities. And I think the thing that's going to be a huge challenge is when you consider things like Baltimore, which is a very poor urban system, with the rest of the state. The funding disparities are going to be a huge issue, as they are all over America. And so it's going to be interesting to see kind of how that develops. But knowing that, where I would start is with school districts. In fact, Mark Tucker's in the process right now of writing a book that's kind of a letter to school district superintendents about, you know, you could do this. And the more examples that we get like that, and we begin to have really thriving school districts because they're treating their people well, it's a learning organization, and the kids are getting better, it's going to start getting attention.
Awesome. Excellent. All right, we're gonna close out.
Thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you so much for coming in and stopping in. We really appreciate it, and we'll be posting the recording later too, so other people can check in and everything. But thanks everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Fun to be back
Close
here.
this out and we'll keep talking.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody. I did double recording so that I make sure
Yeah,
it recorded.
For sure.
Oh, goodness. Let's see.
In fact, my early days in Michigan, I was working in the Ingham ISD Vocational Tech Center with Jan Bernath, if you know her.
I recognize the name, but
Yeah, she was a literacy specialist there, and spent some time down there with, she was trying to develop approach to vocabulary in the machine shops. So that's kind of how I started things.
you wouldn't recognize the place now.
I imagine.
It's real high tech.
Yeah.
Really cutting edge, lots of great partnerships with business and industry.
Yeah. When
And actually, a lot of the programs attract the very top students from the high school.
Oh, good.
Because they're all high-tech programs. And
Yeah.
you have
Yeah.
that skill set, and you have to have those corresponding